You want to come and do it again? So it's my great honor and genuine pleasure to welcome you all to Ping Chong and Calvin Wilkes in conversation with Priscilla Page, Return of the Mothership. The numbers are growing, as you can see. I just want to make, one remark that's most important, and it really was evident just in the love and the warmth in this room. You all have been making wonderful theater already for your time before school, in college, and beyond. Wonderful careers, beautiful work, mostly, right? But that's how we know how to be beautiful the next time. And the most important piece of the relationship that you cultivate in this work, that's what changes. And so when I see this, I'm so encouraged, and it confirms that what we do is really what it's all about. So welcome, thank you for coming, those who came from out of town. I was Facebooking, messaging you, come get on the Mothership. I'm going to introduce Priscilla, because you all know who I am, the voice of the Mothership. It's no joke, it's one of my favorite roles ever. And when I hear it, you know, when I'm watching, as you all will see, the beautiful video later on this evening, when I hear it, I go, yes, we're about to take off. So let me read Priscilla's bio with the voice of the Mothership. Priscilla Page is a writer and dramaturg, as well as a member of the dramaturgy faculty in the Department of Theater at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where she also serves as the director of the Multicultural Theater Certificate. Her research agenda includes Latinx theater and contemporary Native American performance, and she is currently compiling a history of Latinx theater in Chicago. She served as a contributing editor with Joy Harjo on Wings of Night Sky, Wings of Morning Light, a play by Joy Harjo, and A Circle of Responses, under review at Wesleyan Press. She has worked closely with playwright Migdalia Cruz, and her essay, My World Made Real, is published in Cruz's anthology, El Grito del Bronx, No Passport Press 2010. She is also a dear friend of mine and a colleague. We were, as you all know, you've heard the stories, we're not going to let you forget, we were in grad school together. And as tired as you see the grad students and everything, we were there together. In fact, I remember we actually completely lost our stuff sitting right there during a tech rehearsal. We could not stop laughing. And we kind of haven't stopped since, right? And so Priscilla will read the bios of our esteemed guests who are also my art fans. Calvin Wilkes, you and I don't even want to tell them because then we'd be real old, right?
1986!
All right! In a bar.
30 years!
In a bar in a theater in Louisville, Kentucky. Actors Theater of Louisville. I saw him across a crowded room. I said, well, hey, this man. And we've been together for 30 years. Ping and I are new family, although our souls have been together a long time. So, again, the purpose of this work is not only to make beautiful theater, it's to create deep, lasting relationships. And on that note, I welcome Priscilla.
So before I begin, I'll just have to send my love and gratitude to Judy Abalali, who you know recently returned as faculty here and joined me on the faculty here. And she has lifted me up and inspired me. I think there are no limits to how much you have reinvigorated me and inspired me all over again. So thank you for that gift. So I do have a few remarks, as this is somewhat of a lecture format, but also a conversation. And just so you know, I'll make some remarks about Kaleidoscope and the work, and then I'll be introducing and bringing Ping up to the stage. We'll talk briefly, we'll have Talvin join us, and then I think even more exciting than all of that will be that the cast and crew, past members, will also come up on stage and we'll talk a little bit as well. So that's just the format for everybody. Collaborators Ping Chong and Talvin Wilkes explore notions of citizenship, subjugation, and agency in Kaleidoscope, Adventures in Pre- and Post-Racial America, which is now a series. They examine race history in the United States through the lens of an alien gaze, and they ask, how would visitors from another world make sense of a subject fraught with inherent misperceptions, ironies, and contradictions? By taking an alien view of this topic, they examine these issues under a microscope, exploring the pre-Revolutionary War era when freedmen and slaves contemplated their rights in a soon-to-be independent nation, and then moving on to key moments in the civil rights movement of the late 20th century, all the way up to the present day. Kaleidoscope creates a cubistic frame revealing angles from which to observe America's troubled racial history and its ongoing violent consequences, and dare I say we are seeing those consequences now. Chong and Wilkes use found text, transcribed speeches, historical records, and testimonies as they move the audience across time and space, drawing clear lines between this nation's violent racial history and its current state of racial unrest. In Kaleidoscope 2.0, we hear the words of Emily Dickinson, James Baldwin. James Baldwin.
4.0.
That would be
James is always present.
Mary Turner, Fannie Lou Hamer, Paul Robeson, James Baldwin, and many more. Through this host of voices, Chong and Wilkes pose the same question that Baldwin asked students in a 1969 speech delivered at the West Indian Student Center in London. When he asks what is happening in America, Baldwin points to racial violence at the hands of white people and plainly states, it's a problem whether or not you are willing to look at your life and be responsible for it and begin to change it. Woo! He continues the speech by calling himself the most despised child of this house because the American people are unable to face the fact that he is flesh of their flesh, bone of their bone, created by them. Chong and Wilkes, like Baldwin in that speech, hold up a mirror to our society and expose the shadows of humanity to us. Ping Chong's career as an interdisciplinary artist can be marked by Lazarus, his first theater piece produced in 1972. But really, it began much earlier than that. In fact, you could say that he was born to lead the life of an artist. His mother was an opera diva, and his father and grandfathers were directors and librettists in the Chinese opera. In New York City, Chong attended the High School of Art and Design and later studied visual art at Pratt Institute and film at the School of Visual Arts. After college, he met and began working with Meredith Monk, another incredible innovator of the performance world, and he joined her interdisciplinary company, The House, in Lower Manhattan, after taking a movement workshop with her. And he cites that beginning and his longtime relationship with Monk as essential to his life as an artist today. With Lazarus, a theatrical work based on the biblical story of a man who comes back from the dead and then experiences alienation because of his knowledge of the other world, Chong began exploring what it means to be the other in our society. For the past 45 years, he has created visually stunning, highly imaginative performance pieces through which he interrogates the man and his other. In an NEA podcast, Chong explains that his awareness of injustice developed at a very young age. As recent immigrants, his parents discovered they could not continue to live their lives as artists. In Canada, they worked, barely surviving, he tells me, on a potato farm. Later, they moved to New York City's Chinatown. His father worked very hard to support his extended family in the strange and hostile city. Reflecting on his life, Chong says, "My love of creativity came first, but the principles of social justice came to me very, very early. I was aware of injustice as a young boy. As an artist citizen, it is my job to make people aware of their responsibility to a just world." Please welcome. So coming back today, for working with us last year. It was a profound experience to work closely with you, and I know that many of us had a very incredible time with you and Talvin. I want to share another quote by James Baldwin now, and this comes from the opening remarks to Blues for Mr. Charlie, and he writes about Medgar Evers and a trip that they took together through rural Mississippi. He describes interviewing people there about the murder of a black man at the hands of a white shopkeeper. And in Baldwin's words, he says, "Many people talked to Medgar that night in dark cabins with their lights out, in whispers. And then we finished, and then we had been followed for many miles out of Jackson, Mississippi, not by a lunatic with a gun, but by state troopers." He says, "I will never forget that night, as I will never forget Medgar." And then Baldwin closes this note by saying, "We are walking in a terrible darkness here, and this play is one man's attempt to bear witness to the reality and the power of light." And he wrote those words, it's published in, he wrote those words in 1964 in April. And I was just reading through some of Baldwin's writing, and that so struck me. And I'm wondering if you can talk about this sense of spiritual darkness and maybe how that relates to your role and how you see yourself as an artist citizen. Would you be able to speak about that?
This past fall was the making of Kaleidoscope 3.0, and I arrived in Winston-Salem to work on that production at Wake Forest University, and I arrived there the day of the election for the first audition the next day. So you can imagine what that experience was like. And when I got back to, I don't even know if I got back to New York after that yet, but I got an email from a friend, which was an email that said, let's shine a light now. And I sent that to all my friends and said, let's not think about what has happened, but to keep the light shining. And that to me was the most important thing. Because, I mean, we're always going to have to confront darkness. That's just life. I mean, dark and light, dark and light. That's the reality of life, and that's the reality of being a human being. Mm-hmm. So that's my focus, and I have such gratitude that I was doing what I needed to do as an artist in this time, at that moment, to be auditioning for Kaleidoscope 3.0. That I was doing during the whole fall and the whole winter. My work has been about that show, but also we were touring a production with 5 Muslim youth so that they could speak to what was happening in this country and to create a different image of what it means to be Muslim in America. So those two things were happening, and so for me, it's just that I was just felt very fortunate that other people needed to go out and do activism of a different kind, but for me, that was my activism, and I was grateful that I just slid, after the election, I just kept going, you know, and I was very happy that I could do that.
Welcome Talvin Wilkes to the conversation. I want to tell you about Mr. Wilkes a little bit before he comes up. Talvin Wilkes is a master of many things, directing, dramaturgy, playwriting, and producing, just to name a few. He's also now serving as an assistant professor of theater at the University of Minnesota, where he recently directed Marisol by Jose Rivera. He's a thoughtful historian who has taken on the enormous task of documenting Black theater history, talking to professionals about their work from the 1960s forward. He has created a dynamic archive of the Black theatrical tradition that he generously shares with budding artists so that they might understand the substantial foundation that has been laid before them. His commitment to history and tradition is not static. Rather, Wilkes carries it into the rehearsal hall whenever he embarks on a new project. He requires his collaborators to commit to a sense of rootedness with their character work. He asks them to contemplate their characters' individual places in the wider scope of history. With the Kaleidoscope series, he links history directly to practice when he asks cast members, what do we do with our knowledge of racial violence in this country? How do we remember, and in fact, how do we honor those who lost their lives to the brutality of slavery, Jim Crow, and the current attack on the lives of young Black men? As the young actors engage these tough questions, he also reminds them to breathe slowly in and out. And I had the privilege of witnessing him speak to the cast and work in acting sessions with this very simple direction: breathe. Connecting through breath, across space and time, Wilkes links his craft as a director to a much deeper spiritual practice that aims for true freedom and calls to my mind the work of Zora Neale Hurston, Paul Robeson, Langston Hughes. His generous and vivacious spirit, though, also conjures up the words of Entajaki's character Lou, the magician in Spell Number 7. At the end of that play, this magician rallies the chorus onto the stage with the words, "This is black magic you looking at, and I'm fixing you up good. I'm fixing you up good and colored, and you're gonna be colored all your life. You're gonna be colored and love it. You're gonna be colored and love it." Colored and loving it becomes a refrain that turns into a celebration, and Shange writes a serious celebration like church, like home. Indeed, Wilkes carries this vision of love and liberation through creativity and shares it with anyone brave enough to join him on his path. Please welcome Talvin. All right, that was the introduction. I have a question for Talvin. And Talvin,
my mentor.
Yes, this connection here. We really are an art family, as Judy and I became really sisters here. When Talvin came to direct New World Theater in 2002, I had recently finished my studies here. I came on board. We had a little overlap just as he was leaving the university, and I was hired to implement and shepherd through the Multicultural Theater Certificate. And it was through that connection that he invited Ping, and the very first time I met and worked with Ping was on Undesirable Elements, Pioneer Valley. And so that, we really are an art family. So Talvin, speaking about artistic legacy, documentation, and the notion of who gets to be called American and what the American theater canon is, can you share your thoughts on your work as a writer and dramaturg for the American theater? And can you share with us your thoughts about who and what is often missing from that conversation?
Yes. Well, it's very interesting because I'll go back to this idea, the root of what I inherited when I was working for New World Theater and thinking about multicultural theater practice and thinking about history and thinking about lineages. So one of the first actions I think I did was to retool that particular class, which at a time was, you know, sort of a glorified, I'm going to be kind.
An internship.
Internship, yeah,
yes.
in sort of different areas. Mm-hmm. And so we really transformed it into what I called a dramaturg's think tank. And the whole idea was that we were going to wrestle and address this idea of multiculturalism, and at the same time we were going to liberate what one would think of as the American theater canon and think about the multiple lineages that had been excluded from that and should be sort of, and are actually, and that's the key. Mm-hmm. There is an American theater tradition that integrates all of those histories. We just don't study it. It is, you know, sort of entrenched in the way one can think about history, but how we actually sort of teach it, we actually teach an exclusionary idea of what that history is. So the goal for me with sort of the think tank, which ultimately became multicultural theater practice, was this idea of let's trace all of these sort of lineages, these histories that sometimes pop up in the framework of what we think of as a tradition and sometimes not. And let's look at it from many different lenses. you know, through the history of sort of women in sort of the American theater tradition, sort of the gay and lesbian vision inside of the tradition, Black, Latino theater, Native American, you know, all of those traditions and histories are inside of, and what has really impacted the American stage from its earliest beginnings, whether you have to wrestle and fight with the idea of minstrelsy inside of what becomes vaudeville and what becomes this wonderful cauldron of Irish shanties and history and Yiddish theater and you know, the black vernacular and sort of black oral history embedded inside of that. That is the making of the American theater, especially the making of the American theater musical. You know, it just doesn't exist without all of those cultural contributions. We just don't necessarily, and ultimately it's the first understanding of cultural appropriation, you know, is the American musical theater. That's what it is. But we begin to understand it when we navigate and go back and look at, you know, my big thing is the origin stories. You know, well, how does syncopation work in musical? Well, when did jazz, you know, when did tap actually sort of kind of get embedded? Where's the kick line from? You know, it's sort of like, you know, it's a, you know, black musical theater. It's right there. That's when it's created. Shuffle Along. You know, we just saw that history inside of the musical, sort of on Broadway. So for me, the work now and the work that we continue to do and continue to think about and the work that is there for us is to, as I said, liberate the suppressed and repressed history of our theater tradition and really embed it inside of our understanding of what all of us in this room, our collective history is, especially in our understanding of theater tradition. And to know that, and for all of us to embrace that. That's where we are. That's the advantage that you all have, is this greater understanding of what the true American theater history and tradition is. That is much more of a collection, a collectivity of these lineages, as opposed to an erasure. So for me, arriving at that moment in which really multiculturalism in this idea was actually sort of against what I would consider the white mainstream theater tradition at that time, was really to work in how do these things finally become understood as sort of a blended, collective cultural history. So for me, that's why, you know, I do this thing called Living Archive. I look at history as a living, breathing sort of guide of navigation as we are creating and innovating even in this moment, always thinking of future, past, present. Maybe even present doesn't really exist because present is gone. It's history now. 1 second ago is now history. So you're always navigating through future and past, right? And sort of living inside of the moment. But the exciting thing that we have, and the advantage that we have, and the advantage that all of you have, is to really go back and reclaim what was forgotten, lost, suppressed, and erased. And really have, maybe, for the first time in our history, a fuller understanding of what the true American theater tradition is. That's my
Thank you. Can I turn us back into a conversation about Kaleidoscope then? And Ping, I'd like to start with you, and I'd love to hear, maybe you could describe why you choose to interact with history in much of your work, and then specifically choosing such a research-intensive project like Kaleidoscope, which is now a series that has moved from Maryland to Massachusetts and then down to Wake Forest. So I'm interested in
Well, I mean, really, my interest in history really began. The seeds of it were in my very early work already, but really just subliminally. But then around 1992, I started a series of works called the East-West Quartet, which took me a decade to make, which was the beginning of my interest in history as something that is a major part of my theater work. And what interested me about this was the fact that history in itself is so fantastic that you don't need to create surrealistic things. I mean, history already is surrealistic, just all of that. And so it began, and I didn't realize it when I started, But what I was doing was I was excavating history and what was not the official history, and looking at underneath and digging up what was there that should have been visible, that wasn't visible, whether in the context of being an American or as an international artist, what it would mean if when I did excavate in Holland, for example. I did a show about Japan in the West, and I excavated some pretty nasty stuff about Holland and it was a show that was produced in Holland, and it was interesting to see the backlash against me for having dared, as a person of color, to talk about Dutch colonialism in Holland. The interesting thing about that project was that, ironically, before I even made the show, I was already part of four Dutch productions that was to go to Glasgow in Scotland, representing Holland. And what was interesting is when we got to Scotland with my production, the Scottish press said, yes, we know what this colonialism is. This is what the British have been doing to us. So who's looking at it is going to have a different response to it. And when we did I remember doing Deshima, the show was called about Japan in the West, was called Deshima, and when we did it in New York, we did it for the APAP conference, which was the sort of, what I call it, the performing arts meat market, where you sell your wares.
Yeah.
And we did a presentation of that to all these presenters from all over the country who were mostly white. They had come to see the show, and they had all had a nice dinner, and they all had drinks. They came in laughing, and as the show went on, the laughter died, and the realization of what they were looking at changed. So it was so interesting to me to see how you do this show in the different cultural contexts, and what's the response between those who have been exploited and those who were the exploiter. So I wasn't conscious of the fact that I was interested in excavating history, but that was what was happening. And so by the time I got to Kaleidoscope, what was happening, interestingly, it was Kaleidoscope actually, 4 years before that, I had been commissioned to do a show about the Civil War, the American Civil War, in Knoxville, Tennessee. And they said, would you be interested in doing a show about the Civil War? And I said, sure, I don't know anything about it other than the most general information that most people have about the Civil War. And when I decided to do that, I realized I was interested in why did the South lose the war, rather than the official Southern answer, which was they were outnumbered by Northern, unwashed immigrants. That show never happened because I was writing a show that would take 6 hours, and I realized that it wasn't going to happen, and I tucked it away in a drawer. And when Trayvon Martin happened, I was approached by the University of Maryland to commission me to do new work. I said, I want to do something about Trayvon Martin. And that's when I ran into James Baldwin. And Calvin had given me this huge volume of James Baldwin essays, which were called The Price of the Ticket, which I happened to be reading at that time also. And I was Googling Baldwin, and I saw that lecture he gave in London. And I said, this has to be in the show, and that shifted everything for me to be about the show, about the evidence that led up to Trayvon, and that continues today. So all of that was, it evolved for me, that history to me was as interesting as any fiction. That the reality of human culture, human history was crazy and wild enough to work through. But also because so many of these productions were in relationship to being done at universities as well, I was interested in the fact that I'm teaching theater, but I'm also teaching history, and I'm teaching civics, that was important to me. And today, I'm happy if I was just working in a university context to keep excavating that history. Because for me, it's the young who need to know this history in order not, to move forward with a clearer eye. In the same way that Talvin says, you have a chance today to look at this in a very different way than we did, because we didn't know all this when we were in our college days.
And Talvin, when you are researching and writing for a project like Kaleidoscope, a play that breathes life into such intense moments in history, what's the trajectory of your work, or how do you move into that and through that?
I've adopted this strategy that I call the rabbit hole. And it really is this idea and this prompt, and I really just sort of dig in and dig in and dig in an almost exhaustive way. It really has become the foundation of my dramaturgy. And I've been teaching it inside of my sort of creating process classes, this idea of sort of really amassing as much information, and it's really based on a kaleidoscope practice as well. And you're not looking for necessarily the facts that prove this idea are the point. You're looking for these side trends, our sort of like popular culture, our jokes, our songs, our sort of lies, our gossip, or sort of what are all those things that kind of navigate around the truth that really give you a fuller understanding of a moment in history, as opposed to a sort of a fact-based notion, because every era is its popular culture era. We just think of it as past, but they didn't think of it as past. It was the moment, sort of like minstrel show was popular theater at some point. So for me, history has become, and this research idea and this rabbit hole sort of navigation has really become sort of the foundation of everything that I make. And a lot of that really does have to do with working with pink chalk. And sort of we started working in 1993, 94 is when the show started. Yeah, sort of on and undesirable elements in Seattle. I just had the great fortune of being a writer in residence at the Seattle Group Theater, and we had just gotten a Lila Wallace sort of Reader's Digest residency grant from me, and he was there, and sort of I became this sort of collaborator. It was our first time actually meeting, although I had seen Nosferatu in sort of earlier works. But it is that understanding in that process we're doing sort of historical research through individual histories and lineages and sort of cultural archives. But that has really become the foundation of my way of thinking about work, thinking about truth, actually, and honesty inside of anything that I'm trying to interpret at any given time. As he's saying, sort of the facts are greater than fiction, and the resources that you come across almost look like fiction because they're new and discovered and fascinating. And that has really become, I think, an embracing idea even in sort of my own sort of dance and dramaturgy collaborations. Sort of I'm constantly now navigating sort of the impact of history on the understanding of the present.
So can we continue to talk about Kaleidoscope? And Ping, you've already described a little bit of Kaleidoscope 3.0 and going into auditions at the election. How has the urgency of the ideas and the themes present in Kaleidoscope shifted with each production? Because you could mark, I think, the political moment at Maryland, right? I think that we were seeing the riots in Ferguson, Baltimore.
Yeah, we opened in Maryland just as the Michael Brown killing happened. And then the production here was before, obviously, preceded the election year, and then Kaleidoscope 3.0 happened after the election. What was striking to me about the most recent production was how it was not about the past anymore. The production was about the present. Even though the scenes all took place in the past, it felt like we were dealing with what was happening as we spoke. That was what was really kind of very a phenomenon of the third production, how present tense it was rather than past tense.
I think that was always the hope, though. I mean, the goal was we were always hoping that each process, our production would collect immediate history of the moment, and that we would find a way sort of to embed it. Like we started with Trayvon Martin, and then as we were writing, sort of Eric Garner, Michael Brown happened, so that's why we added that sort of memorial later. Sort of this whole evolution sort of came about because we were trying to respond, is there a way that this piece could hold sort of immediate history, you know? And it's hard to wrestle with because we now have so much information. It's sort of like what goes in, what doesn't go in inside of the journey. And then, you know, what was wonderful about this production was really, sort of we started at Maryland, and then this production was really the one that let us know that this is a series, and it's also about local history, that each time sort of we want to do it, we want to do something about the local history, is to weave it into this understanding of sort of time and place inside of a national discussion.
But I think the other thing is that the history is, it's barely the tip of the iceberg of what is still unknown to all of us of this race history. Because when I worked on 3.0, I had to make a decision about what scene am I going to write for North Carolina. And I was looking at several different things, and it was really hard. It took me a long time before I was kind of paralyzed with so much information. And then I finally settled on something. And it was a really strange thing because it was last summer. I was in Yellow Springs, Ohio at Antioch College. I had a friend that teaches there, and I was teaching a workshop there out in Dayton, Ohio. And I was at dinner with a former company member of mine, and they said, well, what are you working on? And I said, I'm working on trying to figure out what scene I'm going to write that's local history for this North Carolina production. And there was another playwright at the dinner, and he said, oh, I happen to have a book here about something that happened in North Carolina. And handed me this book. Why did he have this book? And that book is what I wrote for North Carolina. It was like, it was amazing. You know? So, but because there were other subject matter, like I also thought about the Woolworth sit-ins. When we did go to Wake Forest at Winston-Salem, Jen and I drove down to Greensboro to the Civil Rights Museum, which is the Woolworth, where the sit-in happened. And the original lunch counter where the sit-in happened is intact in the museum. And so, but to have both these experiences working on Kaleidoscope was amazing. You know, to have actually been able to get there to see that was amazing. And there was, and it was the Civil Rights Museum, and I kind of went, well, basically I know what the story is, but there were still things in that museum that were new to me, and one of them was that there was a Coke machine that was in the train station, and it's only one of two of these Coke machines left in the world, one in a private collection and one in the museum. That was at the train station. It was a Coke machine that had two sides, the white side, the colored side, I should say. I always have to keep saying the colored side because I would have been going to that side. And there's a wall between them. And on the white side, it said a Coke. You put your money in and you get your Coke, right? 5 cents. On the colored side, it was 15 cents. Meanwhile, while we were working on this, JP Morgan just got slapped with millions of dollars penalty for cheating people of color for their loans. So what's new? And yet we don't, you know, this was new to me, this little piece, which was a microcosm of what JP Morgan continued to do and car dealerships do to people of color, of charging them more for their loans. You know, so that's what I'm saying, it's a tip of the iceberg, the richness actually also as well of this history is still to be excavated.
Tell them a little bit about that.
The scene, yeah, so this book that was handed to me in Antioch, in Yellow Springs, Ohio, is about something that I'm sure almost nobody here knows about, which is what was described as the Wilmington riots of 1898 in North Carolina, when the Democrats, who were the then Republicans, I'll let you know that, were trying to chase the Lincoln's party out and the black politicians out. That was what the Wilmington riot was.
As a result of Reconstruction, so it's in that particular area.
Right, and it was the local city of, it was the only, historically, it's the only coup d'etat in the United States of a municipal government that was pushed out illegally. And at the same time, it also chased out, because Wilmington was a city which was at that time the largest city in North Carolina. It was also the city where there were actually blacks who were wealthy, who were in every profession, and at the end of this election, which they wanted to reclaim North Carolina back, they pushed the wealthy blacks out, and they pushed the Republican government out, and that was what the thing was about. But it might as well have been what just happened, and that's how it played on stage. And I didn't do any updating, I didn't, at all, but it felt like what just happened, which was amazing.
They had this three-tier strategy,
Yeah.
which was about sort of utilizing violence, vigilantism, to scare the black voting population.
Black
so
and white.
Black and white, so they wouldn't vote. They used sort of denigrated cartoons to depict,
The press, media.
the press used the press to depict African Americans as sort of thieves and scoundrels and rapists, and this is what's going to happen sort of to our women if this is allowed to continue. What was it? Ride
The third were
press.
the red shirts, which were kind of a precursor to the KKK.
Right.
And there was another group, the white something group. But so there was three prongs. The one was violence through intimidation, to promoting brainwashing the public through the media.
Especially targeting sort of lower class whites, Irish, sort of in that time, to really say these blacks are taking your jobs and they're threatening your stability.
And the cartoon part was that there were so many illiterate poor whites that they would use cartoons as the way to get to reach them. And then the other media element was getting orators, Southern orators who were good at whipping up the public to. And this was a strategy by the Democratic Party for a whole year. I mean, they had totally conceptualized how to go about this thing, and they succeeded.
And they effectively erased...
And they called it a riot,
Right.
but in fact it was a coup d'etat.
And they effectively erased any sort of black presence, sort of political sort of leadership for the next 60 years.
Yeah, yeah. This was the last nail in Reconstruction, where they pushed out any semblance of black politicians. That this was it. This was the last nail. Yeah. So that was the scene we wrote.
I'm going to transition us to a moment to welcome up our Kaleidoscope 2 cast members, crew members. Stay within these.
Yes, push together. Take a picture, take a picture.
So, I would like to turn this part of the conversation over to everybody who's just joined us, and anybody's welcome to answer. But my question for you as a group, as cast members, crew members, assistant director, dramaturg, reflecting back from last year and the work that we did on this stage last April, and to today, what have you carried forward? What have you brought with you from that experience? And I really do want to frame it in terms of your artistic selves, yourselves as citizens, yourselves as learners and people engaged with the world. What have you carried forward since Kaleidoscope 2.0?
Can I say one?
Yes, yes.
Which is also very important, because And we're really excited about the idea that these productions are really carrying over sort of support and sort of scholarship and connection from each production. I was not able to participate in the full making of Kaleidoscope 3.0 because I had another job. And so, we had the great honor and pleasure of inviting Jen,
Yes.
who became part of I just learned what really helped to make that happen, the continuation of the work that we developed here into that production. And also we were represented, sort of allowed us to use the template of his great dramaturgical scholarship, which Wake Forest also used. So you were all fully represented in that production. So there is something very important about the ongoing connection, investigation, artistry that we are really very fortunate to be able to utilize and benefit. So thanks. I just wanted to acknowledge that.
Yay, go UMass Theater. So anybody reflecting?
Don't all speak at
Or else I'm gonna start calling you out. Jordan, yes.
I would say having a deeper sense of trust in your cast and presence in the work. Being Mary Turner was really hard, and there were certain rehearsals where Talvin would be it's okay, we are all here for you, you just have to go there. And so that was really moving and inspiring for me, because it was really scary to go there, but it was necessary to be able to tell that story to a different audience. And so it just helped me learn to have a deeper sense of trust and connection in people that I work with, in order to be in that moment, in a place that you're not always comfortable going.
Nice and loud too.
I think for me, having the honor of playing Fanny Lou, it changed my life. Because it made me realize how I didn't know how many Black women played such important roles in our history, because I was never taught that. And to then sit inside of her and to tell her story now makes me want to keep going forward, to keep telling the lives of Black women and making us visible and our voice visible in the work that I do from now on, right? And so it was such an honor to just embrace that, because it changed the way I feel for myself as an actor, as a woman, and as an American. So yes.
And Robin opened her original show, and also Robin received a distinction at Mount Holyoke for her work as a theater artist.
And I had my shoulders down the whole entire time.
I noticed they're good.
Just any other reflections on what you've carried forward, what's still resonating with you? Yeah, go for it. Nice and loud for the camera.
Yeah, I'll say it's first off, it's so wild to have everyone back here in the same space, on the stage. And personally, for me, something that I've now joined the Multicultural Certificate program, and I think something just kind of from the show was really, was my first experience in a really professional theater, and also really with a diverse community. And I feel like there were times where it's gonna sound really weird, but it felt privileged to feel scared about some of my characters, where I was like, oh my God, I had some really harsh characters, and I was like, oh my God, this is so hard for me. And then I was like, wait, people have to go through hearing this every day in a non-acting. And I remember me and Taro had a really good moment where I was like, I just felt so sorry that I was even taking time from the rehearsal process to deal with that, because I was just thinking about the greater context of it. And I feel like that's kind of what this show in particular, and kind of what the multicultural certificate has taught me, is kind of opening my own eyes as taking in these, these other stories and these other, these other Americans, these other people, and but just that kind of for me, and hoping that I can take that with me and continuing that process, not only here at school, but nationally, internationally, wink wink. Who knows where we're all going? Kaleidoskop 2.0.
Yes, go for it.
I guess in correlation with like Kaleidoscope and our presidency and everything that's going on, it really makes me think about what the words like citizenship and belonging mean, especially for some of us who were born in the country and live outside the realm of what is normal. For some of us who pretty much border so many borders, not just culturally, racially, but also sexually. It's kind of almost terrifying. I feel like Kaleidoscope brought like this communal sense of awareness to so many of us, in the sense that, again, given our presidency, now a lot of us have to wake up every single day with this reality that some of us aren't welcome in the country, even though we have this thing called, we're citizens and whatever. So it almost seems like the United States almost promotes like citizenship and belonging, but we don't practice these things. Just like how we treat people who look different than, when what's normal. And I think that the strongest thing that Kaleidoscope, probably the richest thing that it taught me, was the sense of community. Community, because after doing the show, like, you realize that you wake up every day and we're all kind of going through this like similar struggles, and I want to say, more complicated, very, very specific, but the fire is ginormous when everybody comes together and does the work together. And I just think that being around so many talented people, so many people that care about the work and really do want to make a change, it gives me less fear, I think, despite the fact that you have to face so many walls every single day, and it's so difficult to sort of wake up and smile and look at all your loved ones and your family and be like, everything is okay, even though you're fighting a specific battle every single day. So I think that the humanitarian aspect, the loving community, and sort of the power that these human beings here brought on the stage, is probably like the richest thing that I got from Kaleidoscope. And I just hope that we can produce and continue to do this kind of thing, especially when our history is being tainted yet again.
We can also open it up for a few questions or comments as we're moving through the afternoon. Is there any responses from the audience members? Yes.
Hi. I guess I was wondering, I got to see the show last year. I thought it was absolutely phenomenal. I cried for like a solid 90% of it. I guess I'm wondering how all of you, and this is something that was already touched on before, how all of you navigate your own identities when telling some of these stories, how you grapple with things like agency and who can tell a story. As a performer, I think that's one of my biggest difficulties, is figuring out what stories I can tell in the positionality that I'm in as a light-skinned woman of color. And so how do you, I just want to hear, how do y'all navigate your identities, and how do you deal with telling a story, especially when it's sometimes not your own?
Really quick, it was actually like a quote that Ping said a long time ago. Someone had pretty much asked him, like, why are you doing a show that isn't even an Asian, like, American? It's about black people. He said, well, this is my country and this is our history. And I think that if you live like an oppressive lifestyle in any way, shape, or form, then it's one way or another, it's your responsibility to kind of tell the story. At least in my experience, I think that I'm Dominican American, so a lot of the characters that I played were black. I had to sort of compromise, and understand what my own blackness is as a Dominican person. And being as truthful as I possibly can to the stories that were written, because anything outside of that would be fake, and it would be sort of, I guess, hurting the truth. So I think it's always very important to understand what what it says on that page and what the intention of the writer was, and also knowing who you are as a person and where you fall, culturally and racially, sexually.
I think most every role that I had in some way, shape, or form every role that I had in some way, shape, or form was outside of my experience. So with Mary Turner, I've never experienced that kind of violence. I think even in general, that type, you know what, that's debatable, but that type of graphic violence, is that still seen as being commonplace? And like, so I guess that role, I've thought of that in the way that, okay, well, we can't literally rip families to shreds anymore through physical violence, so what ways have we decided to do that now, whether through, you know, poverty or what have you? Like, I guess it's made me think of the ways that keeping families separate has evolved. And then with other characters that I had, they were white. So I guess it made me think of even the humanity of the oppressor, that we have to understand the insecurities that the oppressor would have, and that's why, you know, it's easy to I think to look at someone who's being hateful and assume that that's because they're an evil person, or that's because they're a stupid or hateful person. But in Kaleidoscope, you see that these are people that have families, and these are people that have friends, and these are people that, you know, have goals, and that the reason that they can exist in both spaces is because they have their own insecurities, that they think this is the way that they need to overcome that, and that if we understand that, it makes it easier to prevent, I think, future violence and hatred. And no, it's not people of color taking your jobs. It's lack of funding in something else like that. Being able to study that kind of relationship.
Yeah, I think there were certainly many times that as a white person, playing not only a black man, but a black man who had been lynched, where I was definitely taken aback, saying, how can I be the one who is telling this story? There cannot possibly be, you know, my right to be telling this story. And I think it ties in with what Jordan was saying before about the trust in the community and the artists that you're working with. When I had Talwin Wilkes and Ping Chong blessing me with the opportunity to be the vessel of this storytelling, I had to trust it. And I had to say, no matter who I am, in this moment, am the vessel for this story being told and this voice being heard.
Also, the reason we did that scene that way also was to, so that the white audience could see the humanity in a different way, because if you just had everyone in the same, as black, you don't see the humanity as clearly that way. And we did all the cross-gender, color casting precisely to force the audience to look at this in a new way. That was why we did that, you know.
Tyler and then Jordan, how about that?
Yeah, I'll just quickly, because going off of, I was one of the actors who did the James Baldwin monologue, and that's really tough material to work with, especially coming from a white perspective. But I understood it for that. I as a white male, as a white cis male person, as you know, in this country, the most privileged person, it is my job to vocalize that story, because there are people who won't listen to that story, from people of color and from women, and that's my job, to vocalize that story. And that's why in the casting, I remember my scene in that was excessively talking about the whip and this and how we as white people have done this terrible thing. And sometimes it's although awful and it sucks, sometimes it takes a white person to say it, that they won't listen otherwise, that oppressive people. And that's why when there were things like that, especially with with the John, I don't remember the character's name. I played a rapist at one point. Dave. And I always had to think about the fact that it's about telling that story because that story needs to be told, and it wouldn't be right to force a person of color in that role because it's not people of color who have been doing that. It's white men who have been, taking advantage of, men and women of color, and it's my job to take that role on and to do it, quote unquote, I don't like to say to do it justice, but to show that oppression and to show that anger and evilness, that was there.
And Jordan, yeah.
Going off of what Pink said, for me, I think also telling the stories through the lens of being aliens and then having a multicultural cast that shifts between racial or gender lines, I think illustrated the fact that we commit all this violence on the basis of something that scientifically does not even exist. So I thought that use of storytelling really illustrated that fact and made us question, why do we even create these boundaries or define these things the way that they are defined, even if it has no scientific basis. And it forces you to recognize that it's because of something else.
I think we have time for one more question I can take from the audience. Or, yeah.
So you guys did talk about how you did it in Maryland and then brought it here. As a Marylander, I understand the dynamic between at least Massachusetts and Maryland. With Maryland being wilderness against mine, yet still being very liberal, but very conservative still in some areas, depending on where you go. I just wanted to know, and Castro, feel free to weigh in on your journey with Ping Chong out the most, but I want to know how it was different for you guys being in Maryland, which is a very northern but southern state, and then being in Massachusetts when you guys took this production to different places.
Well, I think one of the interesting things that is more and more important is why we're here, the invitation. And the production here had this incredible invitation from Judy and Priscilla and Gilbert and Megan, and sort of thinking about sort of this kind of community and the history and the legacy that we were celebrating and exploring and investigating. So there were some very specific, there was a very specific invitation to engage in the history of here, in particularly this campus, that fit inside of what we were exploring with Kaleidoscope. So that gave us a foundation and an engagement and this wonderful opportunity to reframe and reshape some of our ideas, but also to put this campus story inside of a national discourse. So that embraced us in that regard. That was very different than, I mean, the Maryland had its specific invitation, and it was also trying to deal and address certain things that had been happening on that campus and sort of framing it around sort of racial lines and challenges that were happening at that time. And so I feel that Wake Forest is also its own particular invitation as to why we are interested in this particular engagement and the conversation that we want this production to have with our community. So for us, we're the Johnny Appleseeds. We'll go on the adventure and we will take that exchange. But I think what I have learned and have grown to appreciate is that, we've learned that it's not a play, it's a process. And that the invitation is key. It's not that, oh, here's an opportunity, come do this play here. But the reasons why and the purpose and the integrity that the inviters have in actually contextualizing why we're here adds to the weight and the importance, I think, of the event. And I think that it cannot and probably should not happen without that. So for us, the idea is we all have these histories. North, south, east, west. You know, the excavation of sort of this kind of racialized insanity that has been going on for centuries is not just located in one place, and it's not just a Southern story. You know, it is a national story. And in each pocket, whether you can deal with, you know, the sundown towns, you know, the place where you were, if you were African American or black, you should not be there after the sun goes down, all throughout the West and proliferating. Sort of the history of when this division of white and black actually existed inside of the colonies. Sort of like, when do these things sort of exist and sort of begin to have impact on, you know, sort of housing, redlining, districting, all of those tactics used north, south, east, west to sort of preserve this history of segregation is ultimately something that I think Kaleidoscope excavates throughout sort of the very earliest foundations of this nation to present. So we are excited about learning and rediscovering and sharing that history from place to place. And it is intentionally distinct and different. Yet now, what's been wonderful is stories from here travel there. Their stories sort of move to the next idea. So that we're actually now beginning to have an even third level of discourse between place to place. So I think it's just getting richer and richer and richer, if that's an answer. You know, it does shift, but you know, the discovery of the sort of the Emily Dickinson and then sort of her father and the Angeline Palmer story. Thank you very much for it. She provided us with that story. You know, is the idea of, and so that's continued to be more and more fascinating each time we gather and think about going somewhere else. I mean, right now we're thinking about going to the University of Dayton, which is a possible one, and that's my hometown. And I'm a little terrified. I know, you know, there's personal history there, and that sort of, yes, maybe I need to do that, because that might ultimately be the most personal production for me. Because it's ultimately about what happened to my grandparents, or what happened to my mother when she would tell stories of being traced across the railroad tracks every day by mobs with rocks, you know, or not being able to try on shoes downtown at Woolworths in Dayton, Ohio, that she had to take a tracing of her foot in order to slip it into a shoe to see if it was the right size. But as a black person, she was not allowed to try on shoes sort of in a downtown store in her lifetime. You know, so, you know, that's Ohio. So it's this, you know, now I'm getting emotional because that's my history and heritage through my ancestors that now could fit inside of a kaleidoscope. So there was a moment when I thought that we were losing our significance because we started with Trayvon Martin, and I thought, it's just growing and growing and growing. But after Wake Forest and after that particular moment, you know, I've come around, and it's actually no, more and more and more.
Well, also the one thing that I was very conscious of, because I had done this Civil War research, which ended up in Kaleidoscope from the earlier show, I also was interested in how the North and the rest of the country is less directly implicated in the racial history than the South is. So I made it a point to really try to research outside of the South as well, to keep reminding the audience. The largest contingent of the KKK is in Indiana. It's not in the South, it's in Indiana. That was the biggest group. You know, so that kind of history, or that, which we didn't include in the show, the fact that Oregon was founded as a white supremacist state, and that the first black person did not enter there until 1928, even though there was a black family, I think, who were pioneers in Oregon before that. But these are things that, you know, we will continue to excavate. But finally, the cross-cultural, cross-gender casting also has to, for me, on another level, has to do with the fact that it also goes back to that thing of why should a Chinese man do a piece about Black history. It's like, no, I'm an American, and it's my history, and I'm part of it. I'm either part of the problem or I'm not. And the cross-cultural casting is that we're Americans, all of us on this stage, you know, and that's why I wanted to cast it that way, because it's our collective society, and it's either going to be a successful society of being one of the most unusual in the sense that it's this mixture of people from all over the world, and who is an American? Who has the right to say who is an American? I mean, the alt-right people want to deny the fact that anybody but Nordic types who were responsible for the growth of the prosperity of this country is a liar. And that history isn't all known either, of the contribution of all the different groups of people who made this country great, you know? And that's part of, we need to figure out how to cross all of these divides to recognize that what makes America special is the fact that we're all trying to get along, try to make it work together and move forward beyond this terrible reality that we still struggle with.
And that it is a collective history and a collective responsibility for us all to learn and understand and embrace that history.
I'm
I
going,
want to say
oh,
one
yes,
last thing.
yes,
I want to
yes.
say, I just want to say how happy I am to see my cast.
Aw, I just have one more part of the program. Many folks on stage, and Judy and Calvin have spoken and mentioned the Multicultural Theater Certificate. And I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that it has been a long time coming, this certificate. And last year, just after Kaleidoscope at graduation, Annabeth Kelly and Kiara Wynn were the first to receive Miguel is in the audience. Miguel Paredes and Jordan Reed are earning the certificate, as is Anderson Lara. And so, because acknowledging the work of the folks who have come before us and who have endured and inspired, I have a Multicultural Theater Certificate to present to Mr. Talvin Wilkes. I'll just read it. This document certifies that you have inspired the creation of the Multicultural Theater Certificate because of his sharp vision, tireless effort, and enduring support of artists of color. His work will always be a part of this first-in-the-nation course of study at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. That's our performance. That's it, folks. Thank you all for coming.
Oh my, oh my, oh
I just
my.
say that Kaleidoscope 2.0 will be screened on the grand stage, and everyone is invited